More than 3 millennia ago, a tempest of unimaginable fury, a storm not of wind and water, but of humanity itself, descended upon the glittering civilizations of the Mediterranean. Great cities that had been beacons of culture and power for centuries were systematically scoured from the earth, leaving behind only windswept plains of ash and scorched stone. Mighty kingdoms, centers of a sophisticated globalized world, dissolved one after another, their names and histories vanishing as though they were merely dreams upon waking. In the scant few records that survived this cataclysm, a single, chilling phrase echoes across the ages: invaders from the sea. The terrified survivors named them the Sea Peoples. They were warriors of shadow and legend, arriving on ships of unfamiliar design, their warriors clad in strange armor and wielding weapons never before seen. They spoke in tongues no scribe could decipher and followed customs no priest could comprehend. No one knew from what distant shore they had sailed, but their arrival heralded the end of an era, shaking the foundations of the entire known world. Remarkably, even with all our modern tools of inquiry, we remain shrouded in much the same ignorance as the ancients. Their ultimate origins are still a profound enigma, their precise motives a subject of fierce debate, their true identity seemingly deliberately erased from the grand tapestry of history. All that we truly know has been painstakingly pieced together from the terror-filled accounts of those who faced their onslaught, the civilizations that somehow endured the tidal wave of destruction they unleashed. Were they a desperate flotilla of migrants, a great folk wandering driven from collapsing homelands by famine and drought? Were they ruthless confederations of pirates, grown so bold as to challenge empires? Or were they something more, a disciplined and organized military force, bent on shattering the world order of their time? Over 3,000 years of history have unspooled, yet the fundamental questions remain unanswered. Archaeologists continue to sift the sands for scattered clues, while historians endlessly debate the fragments of evidence. It is entirely possible that somewhere deep beneath the dust of ages, the full truth about one of the greatest and most consequential mysteries in all of human history lies waiting to be found. This is the saga of the Sea Peoples and of the brilliant age they dragged down into the long twilight of oblivion. We will follow the ghostly trail of their nameless ships, track the bloody footprints of their unknown warriors, and navigate the forgotten chapters of the past to uncover a story that has never been fully told. We will seek to understand who the Sea Peoples once were and why their immense, dark shadow continues to haunt our collective history to this very day. To truly grasp the shock and terror that the arrival of the Sea Peoples sent through the ancient world, we must first conjure an image of the Mediterranean as it was before the crisis. It was a world of profound connection, of dazzling prosperity, and of an almost invisible, fatal fragility. In the centuries between 1400 and the early 1200s BCE, the lands of the Mediterranean and the Near East had entered a golden age of unprecedented development. The great civilizations of the region were not merely flourishing in isolation. They were deeply interwoven through vast and complex networks of international trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. To the south, the new kingdom of Egypt, under legendary pharaohs like Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, and Seti I, stood at the zenith of its imperial power. Monumental temples and colossal statues rose along the fertile banks of the Nile, breathtaking testaments to the pharaoh's unimaginable wealth and seemingly limitless ambition. Egyptian merchant fleets plied the seas, journeying to distant ports to bring back coveted cedar, wood from the mountains of Lebanon, mountains of copper from Cyprus, and precious stones, ivory, and exotic spices from the fabled, faraway land of Punt. To the north, spread across the high Anatolian plateau, the Hittite Empire had risen to become a formidable superpower. From their massively fortified capital at Hattusa, the Hittite kings controlled the vital overland trade routes that linked the markets of the Near East with the resources of the Balkans. The Hittites were not only fearsome warriors, famed for their use of chariots, but were also master diplomats, leaving behind immense archives of diplomatic correspondence that reveal a sophisticated world of international treaties, royal marriages, and shrewd negotiation. To the west, the Mycenaean civilization held sway over the Greek mainland, its power radiating from imposing citadel palaces like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. These were potent and wealthy city-states, capable of mobilizing large armies and fleets, known for their advanced metallurgy and a warrior elite that lived in opulent splendor. From the shores of Greece, Mycenaean ships fanned out across the Mediterranean, their holds filled with wine, fragrant olive oil, finely crafted pottery, and bronze weapons. To the east, the vibrant port cities of the Levant, such as Ugarit, Byblos, and Sidon, acted as the essential middlemen, the bustling commercial hubs connecting this vast regional network. The city of Ugarit, in particular, blossomed as a cosmopolitan center of commerce and innovation. It was here, amidst the noisy docks and sprawling markets, that the world's first true alphabet was developed, a revolutionary system of writing that would become the foundation for countless modern scripts. Further south, the land of Canaan, a territory that would later witness the rise of new peoples, was a region of rich potential caught between the orbits of the great empires. Its people were active participants in the coastal trade, supplying valuable agricultural goods and finished products to the larger markets. What bound these great powers together was not just the threat of military might or the lure of immense wealth, but an intricate and interdependent web of trade that spanned treacherous sea routes and long overland caravan trails. On large, sturdy ships, essential raw materials, especially copper and tin, the two metals required to forge bronze, moved in a continuous, life-giving flow. Archaeologists have discovered astonishing shipwrecks, like the one found at Ulubrin off the coast of modern-day Turkey. Its cargo a perfectly preserved microcosm of this interconnected world, packed with treasures from at least 7 different cultures. It is a vivid testament to the deep economic integration of the time. Yet this very interdependence was also the system's Achilles heel. It was a single, intricate chain, and when its trade routes were disrupted, when even one link in that chain was broken, the entire system was vulnerable to a catastrophic, cascading collapse. Furthermore, many of these outwardly mighty civilizations were built upon highly centralized and brittle structures of authority, leaving them dangerously susceptible to sudden shocks. No one, in their palaces of gold and stone, could have possibly foreseen that within a few short decades, an unknown force from across the wine-dark sea would arrive to shake this entire world order to its very core, triggering one of the greatest and most mysterious collapses in the history of human civilization. At the very heart of this flourishing world was that intricate and far-reaching trade network, an invisible system upon which every kingdom and city-state in the region depended, a delicate thread that bound all their fates together. Picture a sturdy merchant ship departing the bustling port of Ugarit on a calm morning. Stacked carefully on its deck are heavy barrels filled with valuable copper, the prized red metal mined on the island of Cyprus, an island famous across the ancient world for its rich copper deposits. Alongside the copper are rarer, heavier ingots of tin, a metal perhaps sourced from the mountains of Anatolia, or from even more distant and mysterious lands like the Caucasus, or perhaps even, as some scholars speculate, the British Isles. These regions required long, arduous, and perilous trade routes to bring their precious metals to the great markets of the Mediterranean. The alloy of copper and tin, bronze, was the strategic material of the era. It was the substance of power, essential for forging the swords, spears, and armor of armies, as well as the tools for farming and construction, and even the intricate jewelry worn by the elite. Without a steady supply of bronze, the military might and economic dynamism of the great empires would simply grind to a halt. It was the lifeblood of the age. But this ship carried far more than just metals. On board were also massive logs of cedar from the mountain forests of Lebanon, a prized aromatic would use to construct the great warships of Egypt, the grand roof beams of palaces, and the ornate coffins of kings and queens. There was gold carried down the Nile from Nubia, brilliant blue lapis lazuli from the distant mines of Afghanistan, fragrant resins from the Arabian Peninsula, and jars of the legendary Tyrian purple dye, a substance extracted from thousands of tiny sea snails, and so valuable it was coveted by every royal court in the East. Ships like this one were the shuttles that wove the economic fabric connecting Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, Greece, and the islands of the Aegean. In Hattusa, the Hittites imported fine horses and essential tin while exporting early iron goods and luxurious textiles. In Mycenae, treasures unearthed from the tombs of warrior kings reveal artifacts from as far afield as Cyprus, Egypt, and the Near East, irrefutable proof of a vibrant, deeply interconnected world of commerce. Every merchant and every ship was a small but vital link in this vast network. And this network was not merely a channel for physical goods. It was also a superhighway for ideas, technologies, religious beliefs, and languages. The revolutionary alphabet of Ugarit, advanced metallurgical techniques, and even ancient myths and epic poems all traveled across the sea with these trading expeditions. Yet this profound interdependence, the very source of their strength, also left these civilizations more vulnerable than they could have ever imagined. When the tin supply was choked off, when a trade route was disrupted by pirates or war, the consequences were not just the loss of a single commodity, but the potential unraveling of entire economic systems. When we look back at this remarkable period, we cannot overstate the unique role of bronze, the foundational material upon which this prosperous world was built on the eve of the coming crisis. Why bronze? And why would an entire epoch, an entire world system, depend so heavily on this single, man-made alloy? At that time, iron, though known, had not yet been successfully smelted and worked on a large and reliable scale. Bronze, the alloy of roughly 9 parts copper to 1 part tin, was the indispensable strategic material of the age. It was used to forge the swords that decided battles, the spearheads and arrowheads that equipped armies, and the gleaming armor that protected kings and warriors. It also provided the essential tools for agriculture and construction, from plowshares to chisels. Without a steady supply of bronze, armies would lose their military edge. Craftsmen could no longer produce the fine goods that drove trade, and both production and commerce would be crippled. But herein lies the critical point. The raw materials for bronze, copper, and tin were not evenly distributed across the Mediterranean and the Near East. To maintain a steady supply, the great civilizations had to establish and protect long, complex, and often dangerous trade routes that passed through the hands of many intermediaries. Copper was mined in abundance on Cyprus, the era's largest and most famous production center. But tin, which was much rarer, had to be imported from distant, almost mythical regions. Some sources were known to exist in Anatolia or in the mountainous areas to the east. Some scholars have even proposed that a significant portion of the tin supply traveled from as far away as Central Europe or the British Isles, moving through a series of intricate and perilous trade networks. For this very reason, the great powers of the age were forced into a state of mutual dependence to maintain their military strength and economic stability. No single kingdom, not even mighty Egypt, possessed all the resources necessary to operate independently from this shared system. This reality created a world where international connections were not a luxury, but an absolute necessity. The pharaohs of Egypt maintained sophisticated diplomatic relations with the Hittite kings. The Mycenaean city-states fought to control key maritime choke points. And cosmopolitan cities like Ugarit became vital hubs where merchants from across the known world met to trade goods and exchange precious information. We know this not only through archaeology, but also thanks to the miraculous survival of diplomatic correspondence, such as the clay tablets from Amarna in Egypt and from Ugarit, which show kings sending each other lavish gifts of gold, copper, fine horses, skilled artisans, and even royal princesses to strengthen their alliances. But such deep dependence was a double-edged sword. If one crucial link in that long chain broke, if a tin source suddenly ran dry, if a vital trade route was blocked by conflict or piracy, the entire system was at risk of a swift and cascading collapse. Modern scholars often compare this late Bronze Age world to an early form of our own globalized economy. And just like any global economy, it functioned with dazzling smoothness when all its parts worked in harmony, but it was frighteningly fragile in the face of sudden, systemic shocks. At the time, few could have imagined that the forces of just such a shock were already silently gathering on the horizon. And when they finally struck, the entire glittering world order of the Bronze Age would collapse faster and more completely than anyone could have ever thought possible. But no matter how skillful the ancient kings were in their diplomacy, and no matter how vast their trade networks became, there were forces at play that were utterly beyond human control. The first ominous signs of a deepening crisis began to appear not in the courts of kings, but quietly from nature itself. Modern climate research, which combines data from ancient polar ice cores, tree ring analysis, and lake bed sediments, has revealed that in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, the Mediterranean and Near East experienced a period of severe and prolonged climate instability. A pattern of sustained droughts devastated agriculture, especially in regions heavily dependent on reliable rainfall, such as Canaan, the Levant, and even parts of Upper Egypt. Tree ring studies from the ancient pines of Anatolia show years of stunted growth, clear scientific evidence of extended water shortages that would have led to widespread crop failure. In addition, sediment layers taken from lakes in the Levant reveal sharply reduced rainfall cycles, a pattern of aridification that coincides with periods of social unrest and famine recorded in ancient texts. In an economic system that relied heavily on agricultural surplus and imported grain shipped over long sea routes, the great kingdoms began to feel mounting pressure from within. Food became scarce. Prices for essentials skyrocketed. Hunger and discontent began to spread through the countryside, the very regions that had long supplied soldiers and laborers to the royal courts. But nature's fury was not limited to drought. Powerful earthquakes, now confirmed by archaeological evidence of fault line damage and the sudden structural collapse of buildings at excavation sites, struck down key cities. Ugarit, Hattusa, Mycenae, and many other centers show clear signs of massive earthquake destruction occurring either just before or during the waves of violent attacks. Great walls crumbled not from the blows of a battering ram, but from the terrifying force of the earth itself. Storehouses filled with grain were buried, and once majestic temples were reduced to heaps of rubble. In a world where a king's authority was intimately tied to his perceived ability to mediate with the gods and protect his people from the forces of nature, such disasters dealt a profound psychological blow. Beyond the physical evidence, surviving diplomatic letters also offer a vivid glimpse into the anxious mood of the time. From clay tablets excavated from the ruins of Ugarit, we can read desperate pleas for help, urgent reports of food shortages, mentions of civil unrest, and accounts of streams of migrants fleeing drought-stricken lands. These messages reveal a world that was cracking apart from within. An interdependent system, once thrown into chaos by nature's whims, struggled to maintain any semblance of stability. It was into this fraught context, where food supplies were dwindling, natural disasters were striking with terrifying frequency, and social tensions were simmering just below the surface, that the Sea Peoples would finally emerge. But were they the ultimate cause of this great collapse? Or were they simply an inevitable symptom of a world that was already unraveling? That question, even today, remains one of the most debated aspects of this mystery. Perhaps the clearest and most heart-wrenching picture of a world coming undone is not found in the cracks in the earth, but in the trembling words etched into small, fragile tablets of clay. Letters of desperation exchanged between kings, now unearthed from the smoldering ruins of the city of Ugarit. At the time, Ugarit was a flourishing commercial metropolis on the coast of the Levant, a vital crossroads in the region's vast economic network. The city was not only fantastically wealthy, but also remarkably advanced in its administration and literacy. It is here that archaeologists have uncovered a library of more than 1,000 inscribed clay tablets, meticulously recording commercial transactions, international treaties, and sensitive diplomatic correspondence. Among them are letters that, even after 3,000 years, still send a chill down the spine when read today. One such letter, sent by the desperate king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus as enemy forces closed in, reads, "The enemy is at my gates. My city is in dire straits. Send reinforcements and food at once, if possible. If not, I fear that Ugarit will not be able to hold out." Those simple, frantic words reflect a world once accustomed to the formal ceremonies of trade and diplomacy, now suddenly thrust into a brutal fight for its very survival. The letters also reveal the catastrophic disruption of the trade system itself. In one message to the king of Alatia, or Cyprus, the king of Ugarit complains that his merchant ships can no longer safely dock because strange pirates have appeared off the coast, and he laments that the once reliable shipments of copper and tin have failed to arrive. Taken together, these scattered details reveal a regional economy, once running like a finely tuned machine, now grinding to a halt. As the vital trade routes broke down, military and food supplies across the great kingdoms quickly plunged into a state of crisis. What is particularly striking is how the tone of these letters shifts so dramatically over time. In earlier tablets from Ugarit, one finds formal greetings, polite invitations to exchange gifts, and complex royal marriage negotiations, all reflecting a world of confident, prosperous rulers who believed their power was secure. But in the final letters, written just before the city was consumed by fire, all of that confidence has evaporated. In its place is raw panic, desperate pleas for aid, and undisguised fear. Kings who had once seen themselves as standing at the pinnacle of worldly power were reduced to writing frantic appeals, as vulnerable as any of their common subjects. And then, one day, Ugarit fell. When archaeologists uncovered these last tablets, many were found sitting in the kilns where they were being fired for preservation, never sent. Those final, undelivered letters remain a vivid and poignant testament to a world unraveling. In every line pressed into the damp clay, we can still feel the last, ragged breath of a dying era. And it was at this very moment of maximum vulnerability that the Sea Peoples began to emerge from the shadows, acting as either the agents or perhaps the symbols of the end of that once glorious age. It is difficult to imagine that just a few short years before those desperate pleas were hastily inscribed onto clay, the great cities of the Mediterranean still basked in an atmosphere of rare prosperity and unwavering confidence. Ugarit, for example, was not merely a bustling seaport, but also a major cultural and intellectual center. In the grand, multi-storied homes of its wealthy merchants and nobles, fine imported pottery, shimmering gold and silver jewelry, and intricately carved ivory figurines were displayed everywhere. This was clear evidence of an affluent class that loved beauty and spared no expense in decorating their lives. Merchant ships from across the known world came and went from its harbor in a constant, reassuring flow. The markets bustled with the sights and sounds of commerce, filled with silks, exotic spices, colored glass, and precious metals from distant lands. On the city's walls and in its temples, skilled artisans depicted vibrant images of gods and ancient legends, their art reflecting a self-assured and sophisticated culture. Hattusa, the imperial capital of the Hittite Empire, was no less magnificent. Its temples and massive city gates were constructed from colossal blocks of stone, many adorned with detailed carvings of gods and protective lions. In the palaces, meticulous scribes carefully recorded treaties, laws, and significant historical events on clay tablets, as if time and history were theirs to command for eternity. To the west, in the Mycenaean city-states, The life of the aristocracy revolved around grand palace complexes where vivid frescoes covered the walls, portraying thrilling hunting scenes, solemn religious rituals, and daring sea voyages. Mycenaean warriors, clad in gleaming, tusked helmets and heavy bronze armor, paraded in great festivals, proudly honoring the strength and martial traditions of their people. Even ordinary citizens, though not living in luxury, benefited from this prosperous, globally connected economy. They wore finer fabrics, used better-made household goods, and had access to small luxury items that had once been reserved exclusively for the elite. In religious ceremonies, solemn processions continued as they always had. Priests offered the finest goods to the gods, not only to seek their blessings but also to display their city's wealth and power to the world. And above all, what the people of this age likely felt most deeply was a profound and unshakable faith in the stability of their world order. Kings proudly had their victories and distant treaties carved into stone monuments. Merchants eagerly invested vast sums in long and risky sea voyages. People lived their lives with the underlying belief that their world, with all its brilliance and complexity, would endure for generations to come. No one could have imagined that in just a few short years, it would all be reduced to ash and ruin. Mighty fortresses would be consumed by fire. Vital trade routes would be severed forever. The joyful sounds of festivals and markets would be replaced by desperate cries echoing across a devastated land. And so, when we read those final, unsent letters from Ugarit, or when we stand today among the silent, tumbled ruins of Mycenae or Hattusa, we see more than just broken stone and shattered walls. We feel a deep and lingering sorrow for a world that once gleamed with life and confidence, now reduced to little more than the faint, haunting echoes of a bygone age. Amid the dazzling prosperity and confidence we've just painted, the first deep undercurrents of the coming storm began to stir. They appeared not as a declaration of war, but as a few quiet words etched into a slab of stone, like a faint, chilling warning from the past. The earliest undisputed written evidence we have of the Sea Peoples comes from a famous monument, the Merneptah Stele, sometimes called the Victory Stele of Merneptah, erected around 1207 BCE in Egypt. At that time, Pharaoh Merneptah, the son and successor of the great Ramesses II, faced mounting threats on both Egypt's western and eastern frontiers. In the inscriptions praising his military victories, nestled alongside triumphant accounts of his triumphs over the Lebu and Meshwesh tribes in the west, there appears a seemingly minor detail, one that would unwittingly open the door to one of the greatest mysteries of ancient history. The inscription proclaims, "Canaan has been plundered. Ashkelon has been captured. Gezer has been seized. Enoam has ceased to exist. Israel is laid waste. Its seed is no more." And then it adds, the Shurdin, Shekelesh, Ekwesh, Lukka, and Teresh, those who came from the distant sea, have been defeated, no longer a threat to the land of Egypt. These names, Shurdin, Shekelesh, Ekwesh, Lukka, and Teresh, would later become the key clues for historians attempting to trace the path of the Sea Peoples. What immediately stands out is the way these groups are described. Came from the distant sea, a phrase that is both tantalizingly specific and shrouded in profound mystery. No earlier Egyptian records had ever mentioned these peoples by these names. They did not belong to the traditional powers, like the Hittites or the Mitanni, that Egypt was accustomed to confronting. Modern scholars believe these may have been migrating groups or opportunistic warrior alliances, appearing for the first time on the historical stage, just as the pressures of climate change and social upheaval were intensifying across the region. It is also worth noting that Egyptian pharaohs were highly deliberate in how they recorded their victories for posterity. The very fact that these unknown groups from the sea were mentioned on an official victory monument as significant as the Merneptah Stele suggests that the conflicts with them were considered major engagements, worthy of inclusion in the official annals of history. It was a clear sign that the presence of the Sea Peoples was no longer a minor nuisance, but a growing threat. Moreover, The simultaneous mention of Canaanite cities being destroyed in the same passage strongly indicates that these seaborne groups were not only clashing with Egypt, but were also having a major impact on the wider Mediterranean region, where fragile trade systems and political alliances were already under immense strain. From these few lines of carved stone alone, we can already sense a new wave of instability rising from the sea, one that even the mighty pharaohs of Egypt could no longer afford to ignore. And as we shall see, this was only the first tremor before the earthquake. In the years to come, these groups would not limit themselves to coastal raids. They would organize into vast migratory forces, bringing with them their families, their women and children, and all their worldly possessions, pushing deep into the fertile lands of the Near East and reshaping the entire political and economic landscape of the region for the century that followed. What was carved into the Merneptah stele still echoes to us across time. A world that had once seemed unshakable was standing on the brink of its greatest upheaval. If the inscriptions on the Merneptah stele were the first chilling warning of the Sea People's presence, then less than 3 decades later, the entire Egyptian world will be forced to confront the full, terrifying force of the storm they had become. Around the year 1175 BCE, during the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III, Egypt was drawn into one of the most decisive and desperate battles in its long history. It is a battle we can vividly picture today, thanks to the incredibly detailed and dramatic reliefs carved onto the mortuary temple walls at Medinet Habu in Thebes. Those images, though more than 3,000 years old, remain astonishingly sharp and striking, as if they were etched only yesterday. And within these stone panels, we see with our own eyes that an enormous force from across the sea had arrived, a force bringing not only elite warriors, but entire migrating communities, women, children, and families riding in heavy, solid-wheeled ox carts loaded with their possessions. This was a clear sign that they sought not simply to plunder and retreat, but to conquer and claim new lands for themselves. According to the inscriptions of Ramesses III, this great coalition of sea peoples included several distinct groups: the Peleset, the Jeker, the Shikalesh, the Denyen, and the Weshish. These are names that remain the subject of intense, scholarly debate today, as researchers continue their quest to uncover their true origins. The reliefs depict well-equipped fleets of sea people's ships with high prows and sterns, powered by both large, broad sails and oars. Their warriors are shown wearing highly distinctive horned or feathered helmets, carrying round shields, and wielding unfamiliar long swords and spears. This is clear evidence that they were not a disorganized band of raiders, but a formidable force deliberately prepared for large-scale warfare and settlement. Ramesses III, however, had anticipated this confrontation. He had stationed ambush forces along the coastline and deployed his Egyptian warships strategically across the mouths of the Nile Delta, creating deadly choke points that the Sea People's ships would have to cross to advance inland. When a massive battle finally commenced, the invaders' ships were cleverly lured into the shallow, constricted waters of the delta, where they became entangled and were easy targets for the pharaoh's archers and infantry, who were positioned on both banks of the river. The carved scenes show the Sea Peoples fighting with ferocious courage, but they also graphically depict their defeat: bodies floating in the blood-reddened river, shattered ships being overturned, and captured migrants being led away in chains. In the accompanying inscriptions, Ramesses III boasts of a total and resounding victory. Those who came from the sea, I have hurled them back into the sea. They lie scattered upon the sands. None remain to carry word home. Yet, behind these triumphant and bombastic words lies an undeniable truth. This was no minor coastal raid. It was a desperate, large-scale migration, a monumental clash between the established power of Egypt and a massive wave of displaced peoples seeking resettlement rather than mere plunder. Moreover, despite Ramesses III's claim of a glorious victory, Egypt was not left unscathed. The pharaoh's kingdom survived, but its imperial territories in the Levant, long under Egyptian influence, were permanently lost in the aftermath of this crisis. Egypt's international power was significantly diminished, and its domestic economy suffered greatly from the immense cost of the war. And this was only one piece of a much larger, catastrophic picture. While Egypt managed to weather the storm and retain some measure of stability, many other kingdoms were not so fortunate. The great tide of the Sea Peoples continued its inexorable sweep across the Mediterranean, leaving a trail of charred cities and shattered civilizations in its wake. As we gaze upon the dramatic reliefs at Medinet Habu today, we see more than just vivid scenes of ancient battle. We are witnessing a pivotal turning point in world history, a moment where an old, interconnected world was beginning to fade away and a new, unstable, and chaotic order was rising from its smoldering ashes. As historians meticulously study the surviving records, from Merneptah stele, from the reliefs at Medinet Habu, and from various other scattered textual sources, they have identified a list of names that are closely and repeatedly associated with the Sea Peoples. This list includes the Shur-Den, the Shikalesh, the Peleset, the Jeker, the Denyen, and the Lutka. These are names that are both strange and haunting, and each one raises questions that remain tantalizingly unanswered to this day. What is most remarkable and most frustrating is this: not a single text written by the Sea Peoples themselves has ever been found. Absolutely everything we know about them comes from the records of those who fought against them, primarily the Egyptians, a civilization with a long and meticulous tradition of documenting its military encounters. Let us take a closer look at these enigmatic groups. The Shur-Den are often described as elite warriors, easily distinguished in carvings by their iconic horned helmets, fine bronze armor, and large round shields. Some scholars have suggested a possible connection to the island of Sardinia, where ancient cultural artifacts show intriguing similarities, but the evidence remains circumstantial and inconclusive. The true origins of the Shur-Den remain a complete mystery. The Shikalesh is a name that evokes possible links to Sicily, although, as with the Shur-Den, this connection is highly speculative and based mainly on the linguistic resemblance of the names. No definitive archaeological proof has yet been discovered that ties them to the island. The Peleset are perhaps the one group with the clearest historical footprint. A strong consensus of historians agrees that the Peleset were the direct ancestors of the Philistines, who later settled along the coast of Canaan and founded the famous cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod. Archaeological evidence from this region clearly shows the arrival of a new and distinct material culture, one with strong Aegean influences that is starkly different from the native Canaanite culture. The Jeker were another group that settled in the Levant, leaving faint archaeological traces in the region of Dor. Yet their original homeland is completely unknown. No one knows where they came from before they joined the Great Migration of the Sea Peoples. The Denyen are perhaps the most controversial name on the list. Some prominent scholars have linked them to the Danuna or Danawi, an ancient term sometimes used to refer to the Mycenaean Greeks. If this connection is true, it would suggest that among the waves of the Sea Peoples were groups originating from the collapsing civilization of Greece. But this remains a compelling, yet unproven, hypothesis. The Lutka are often associated with the region of Lycia in southwestern Anatolia, an area known to have a long history of skilled seafaring and, at times, piracy. But were the Lutka mentioned in the Egyptian texts truly the same people as the Lycians known from later historical periods? That question, too, remains unanswered. The common, frustrating thread that runs through all these names is this: we simply do not know where any of them truly came from. No ancient map records a kingdom of the Shur-Den or a territory of the Denyen. No city has ever been identified that claims to have been the original homeland of the Peleset before their arrival in Canaan. And no written chronicle from any of these groups has ever been found. This makes the Sea Peoples an exceptionally elusive and mysterious historical phenomenon. Were they independent groups of peoples who were thrown together by circumstance and formed a temporary alliance? Or were they a more organized confederation with a shared purpose of migration and conquest? To this day, historians have no definitive answer. And it is precisely this deep and enduring ambiguity that ensures the story of the Sea Peoples will forever carry the aura of an unsolved mystery, a true piece of forbidden history from the heart of the ancient world. But perhaps what left the strongest and most terrifying impression of the Sea Peoples, both upon the ancient civilizations they encountered and upon us today, was not simply their mysterious names, but their striking and formidable warrior imagery, so vividly preserved in stone reliefs, most notably on the monumental walls of the Medinet Habu Temple. As one walks through the temple's grand colonnades, vivid and chaotic battle scenes unfold before the eye. We see disciplined Egyptian soldiers confronting unfamiliar warriors from across the sea, figures who are markedly different from Egypt's traditional enemies, such as the Libyans or the Canaanites. The most distinctive feature is their headgear. Many of the Sea People's warriors are depicted wearing elaborate helmets adorned with two sharp, curving horns, or at times, wide-brimmed helmets decorated with a tall, projecting crest of feathers or horsehair. This was a style completely alien to Egyptian or neighboring military traditions. These helmets were clearly not merely functional pieces of armor. They seemed to have carried powerful symbolic meaning, perhaps signifying a warrior's rank, strength, or a distinct cultural identity. This single detail has sparked decades of debate among historians and archaeologists. Were these ceremonial helmets reserved only for leaders, or did they reflect a characteristic warrior tradition shared across various groups of the Sea Peoples? In addition, we see them carrying large, round shields. Some are shown as convex, others as flat, often with a prominent metal boss at the center designed to deflect sword blows or to be used offensively as a weapon in close-quarters combat. This type of shield was common in the Aegean and Anatolian worlds, but was relatively unfamiliar to Egyptian soldiers, who typically favored long, oval, or rectangular shields for their infantry formations. As for their weaponry, the Sea People's warriors are shown wielding short, double-edged swords designed for slashing and thrusting, large daggers, and at times, throwing spears. Notably, some of the reliefs depict them with elegant, leaf-shaped swords, a style that is remarkably similar to weapons that have been found at Mycenaean archaeological sites in Greece. This detail further strengthens the theory of potential links between some of the Sea Peoples and the cultures of the Aegean. Their attire is also striking. Many of the warriors are shown wearing short, fringed kilts or skirts, with their legs bare or clad in light footwear. Such clothing would have allowed for agile and rapid movement, ideal for fighting on the crowded decks of ships or for conducting swift coastal landings. Taken together, these elements created an image of warriors who were both foreign and deeply formidable. To the Egyptians, who were well-versed in the arms and tactics of their traditional foes, the Sea Peoples must have appeared both alien and profoundly threatening. And it was precisely this visual difference that reinforced the sense that they came from distant, unknown lands, bringing with them a distinct military tradition that was not part of the established cultures of the Mediterranean at the time. To this day, archaeologists continue to meticulously compare the warrior imagery of the Sea Peoples with artifacts found in Sardinia, Sicily, Lycia, and Mycenaean Greece. Yet no definitive conclusions have been reached. Every single detail, the horned helmets, the round shields, the unfamiliar swords, remains a tantalizing, scattered puzzle piece in a portrait that is still waiting to be completed. When we examine the reliefs of Medinet Habu and the inscriptions of Merneptah, one thing becomes undeniably clear. The Sea Peoples were not merely fleeting shadows passing through history. They were a force powerful enough to be immortalized on the stone monuments of Egypt and numerous enough to trigger one of the greatest and most widespread crises of the Late Bronze Age. But who were they really? This is one of the central questions that has kept historians debating for more than a century. Two main theories have emerged to explain their nature. Were they simply daring and opportunistic bands of pirates? Or were they part of a much larger, organized wave of mass migration that helped plunge the entire Mediterranean world into chaos? The first theory, that of piracy, is rooted in how the earliest Egyptian texts describe their encounters with the Sea Peoples. Swift, unexpected attacks from fast-moving ships, sudden raids along the coast, plundering resources, and then withdrawing quickly back to the sea. These tactics fit well with the style of organized piracy, which was already a common menace in the Mediterranean during antiquity. Furthermore, certain groups, such as the Lukka, who are often connected to the Lycian coast, a region long associated with skilled seafarers, warriors, and pirates, seem to support this interpretation. But if they were only pirates, why do the later, detailed reliefs at Medinet Habu depict women, children, and entire migrating groups traveling in ox carts? And why, during the major assault under Ramesses III, did the Sea Peoples bring with them wagons loaded with all their worldly possessions, their livestock, and their tents? These are the clear signs of a people on the move, of migration, not of mere raiding expeditions. This crucial detail opens the door to the second major theory, one that is now supported by many modern scholars, that the Sea Peoples represented an organized and massive wave of migration, born out of profound and widespread upheaval across the ancient world. A perfect storm of crises, prolonged climate change and droughts, devastating earthquakes, and the subsequent collapse of international trade networks. All of these factors could have turned once thriving lands into harsh, unsustainable environments. In this context, entire groups from heavily affected regions, perhaps from Anatolia, the Aegean, or even farther west, may have been forced to abandon their homelands, carrying their entire communities with them in a desperate search for new places to settle. Such mass migrations, when met with resistance from established civilizations, could easily turn violent, transforming into full-scale wars and destructive raids. And this may be how the Sea Peoples ultimately carved their infamous place in history, not simply as pirates, but as desperate, determined, and well-armed communities fighting for their very future. Even so, the question remains open. The Sea Peoples may not fit neatly into any single category. They may have been a complex combination of many different groups, some of them pirates, some of them displaced migrants, some professional mercenaries, and some climate refugees. It is this very diversity and complexity that makes the Sea Peoples so elusive and so captivating for anyone drawn to the deeper mysteries of ancient history. To truly understand their nature, we must explore every theory, sift through every archaeological clue, and study every surviving text. It is a journey that, the deeper we go, reveals that some parts of history are still not ready to give up their most profound secrets. Debates over the true nature of the Sea Peoples may continue indefinitely, but the devastating consequences they left in their wake are undeniable. The city of Ugarit stands as perhaps the most vivid and tragic testament to their impact. Situated on the northern coast of the Levant, in what is now modern-day Syria, Ugarit was once one of the greatest commercial and cultural centers of the Bronze Age. From its harbor, Ugarit's merchant ships sailed across the Mediterranean, trading in copper, tin, cedarwood, colored glass, fine textiles, and countless other luxury goods. The city was not only wealthy, but also remarkably advanced and cosmopolitan. The Ugaritic alphabet, one of humanity's earliest and most influential writing systems, was invented here, laying the foundation for the Phoenician script and, ultimately, for many of the world's modern alphabets. The royal palace of Ugarit was a vast and sprawling complex, housing archives with hundreds of clay tablets that recorded commercial transactions, diplomatic treaties, and royal correspondence. Documents that have greatly enriched modern historians' understanding of the region's political and economic landscape on the very eve of the Sea Peoples' onslaught. But all of that sophistication and prosperity came to a sudden and violent end. The final, desperate letters of the king of Ugarit, as we saw earlier, clearly reflect the city's growing panic as enemy forces, widely believed to be the Sea Peoples, closed in from the sea. And then Ugarit vanished from history. Modern archaeological excavations at the site of Ras Shamra, where Ugarit once stood, have revealed a thick, uniform layer of ash and destruction blanketing the entire city. Walls have collapsed, brickwork is blackened with fire, and clay tablets are shattered or fused together by the extreme heat. What is most striking and most telling is that there is no evidence that Ugarit was ever significantly rebuilt. There are no new layers of habitation, no signs of recovery. The once prosperous city was abandoned forever after the attack. Archaeologists also found many unfinished clay tablets still sitting in kilns, a chilling sign that the assault struck so suddenly that the city's artisans did not have time to complete their work. Some of the final diplomatic letters were found still lying on writing tables, never sent. All of this evidence speaks to the sheer ferocity of the destruction that Ugarit suffered and to the utter helplessness of its ruling powers in the face of the Sea People's tide. With the fall of Ugarit, a vital link in the great Mediterranean trade network was severed. And as that critical link collapsed, the entire interdependent economy of the region shuddered in response. Today, as we gaze upon the charred ruins of Ugarit, its blackened walls and the fragmented remnants of its precious clay tablets, we cannot help but feel a deep and profound sense of loss. A center of wealth, civilization, and creativity was erased in an instant from the flow of history, as if it had never existed. And Ugarit was only one of many victims of the Sea People's tide, a wave that continued to surge unstoppably across the Mediterranean world. If the fall of Ugarit revealed the destructive power that the Sea Peoples could unleash upon wealthy coastal trade centers, then the story of Hattusa, the mighty capital of the Hittite Empire, opens an even more haunting and mysterious chapter in this saga. Nestled deep within the rugged Anatolian plateau, far from the sea, Hattusa was once the heart of one of the greatest superpowers of the Bronze Age. The Hittite Empire not only controlled vast territories stretching from Anatolia to the Levant, but also stood as Egypt's chief rival in international diplomacy and warfare. The city of Hattusa itself was built across a vast, rocky expanse, fortified by massive stone walls, monumental carved gates, and grand royal palaces. Within its archives, archaeologists have unearthed an astonishing trove of more than 30,000 clay tablets, documenting every aspect of Hittite life: law, diplomacy, religion, and war. And then, around 1200 to 1190 BCE, Hattusa was suddenly and violently destroyed and then abandoned. Archaeological excavations reveal widespread and definitive signs of destruction and fire across the entire city. But herein lies the mystery. There is no direct evidence that the Sea Peoples themselves attacked Hattusa. At least, no surviving Egyptian or Hittite records mention such an assault. Yet the timing of its fall is too striking to be a mere coincidence. The abandonment and destruction of Hattusa occurred precisely during the period when the Sea Peoples were sweeping across the eastern Mediterranean, and as the international system of alliances and trade was crumbling all around them. Some scholars suggest that after devastating the coastal centers that supplied the Hittites with goods and grain, the Sea Peoples may have indirectly triggered fatal internal unrest within the already weakened Hittite Empire. It was an empire that was already reeling from the effects of a severe climate crisis, prolonged drought, and ongoing conflicts with restless mountain tribes. The final royal letters from the Hittite archives carry a desperate and familiar tone, filled with pleas for grain shipments and military aid sent from the Hittite king to his vassals and allies, pleas that are eerily similar to the final letters from Ugarit we encountered earlier. What is certain is this: Hattusa was never rebuilt after its destruction. The Hittite Empire, once a power equal to Egypt, simply vanished from the historical map, giving way to an era of chaos and fragmentation in which small kingdoms and migrating peoples came to dominate much of Anatolia. What truly happened in Hattusa's final, desperate days? Did the Sea Peoples, or a branch of them, push inland and directly assault the city? Or did their broader impact, through the complete collapse of trade networks and the spread of regional instability, push the already teetering empire into an irreversible crisis? No one can say for sure. But the timing, combined with the clear evidence of broken trade links and a spreading wave of collapse, strongly suggests that the shadow of the Sea Peoples surely loomed over the end of Hattusa, whether by direct force or by indirect consequence. And that shadow would continue to spread as we follow their destructive trail to other great cities of the dying Bronze Age world. As Hattusa lay silent in its ashes on the Anatolian plateau, the great wave of crisis did not stop. It swept westward across the Aegean Sea and struck at the very heart of the Mycenaean world, the brilliant Greek civilization of the Bronze Age. The Mycenaean civilization, renowned for its mighty citadel cities like Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes, was one of the Aegean's most powerful commercial and military forces. Its fortified palaces, surrounded by towering cyclopean walls made of stones so large that later Greeks believed they were built by giants, and the countless golden treasures discovered in its royal tombs, all reveal a society that was both prosperous and highly sophisticated. The Mycenaean system of rule was centered around these great palace complexes, from which the king, known as the Wanax, controlled the economy, the military, religious rites, and foreign diplomacy. Their extensive trade routes stretched across the Mediterranean, allowing them to exchange goods with Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia. And yet, by the late 13th to early 12th century BCE, one after another, the great Mycenaean cities began to fall. At Mycenae itself, excavations have revealed thick layers of ash covering the architectural remains, clear signs of an intense, city-wide fire. Granaries, armories, and residential quarters all show evidence of simultaneous and violent destruction. Pylos, which was one of the largest and best-preserved administrative centers of the Mycenaean world, met a similar fate. At the so-called Palace of Nestor, thousands of clay administrative tablets were hardened in the blaze that consumed the palace, which is ironically why archaeologists are still able to read them today. Yet, one of the final sets of tablets records frantic orders to mobilize defensive troops and prepare warships for coastal defense, suggesting that the final attack came swiftly while the city was still desperately trying to organize its defenses. At Tiryns, one of the strongest and most heavily fortified of the Mycenaean fortresses, we find more of the same story: collapsed walls and scorched buildings. The entire palace system, which had once been the unshakable backbone of Mycenaean power, collapsed completely within the span of just a few decades. What is most striking is that there are no signs of lasting reconstruction at these major sites. The Mycenaean civilization, so heavily dependent on its intricate and centralized palace network, was simply unable to recover from the blow. Some scholars argue that this destruction may have been driven by internal factors, such as peasant rebellions or civil wars between the city-states. But when we compare the timing with the known campaigns of the Sea Peoples through the Levant and Egypt, and when we consider the Mycenaean royal records that mention preparations for naval defense, many historians believe that the Sea Peoples likely played a major role in this collapse, whether through direct attacks or through the indirect effects of severing their vital trade routes. Moreover, in the wake of this widespread destruction, the entire Mycenaean world entered a period of deep and prolonged decline. The linear B script, the writing system used by the ruling class, vanished completely. International trade ceased. The great city-states fragmented, and the population retreated into smaller, poorer, and more isolated communities. It was from this profound void that Greece's so-called Dark Age began, a period of cultural and economic regression that would last for centuries, until the Greek world finally rose again in the archaic and classical eras. As we look upon the charred walls and scorched tablets of Pylos or Mycenae today, it is hard not to shudder at the scale of the catastrophe. A proud civilization that had once dominated the Aegean, that had challenged the great powers of the Near East, collapsed in a terrifying blaze of fire, taking with it the sophisticated palace system that had defined its rule for centuries. And though the Sea Peoples are not always clearly named in the fragmented Greek texts, their immense, destructive shadow remains, an unstoppable wave that seems to have swept across everything in its path. While the Mycenaean civilization faded into a long twilight across the Aegean to the east in the land of Canaan, the Sea Peoples left marks that would prove to be even more lasting than material destruction. They brought about deep demographic and cultural changes, the traces of which can still be seen to this day. Canaan, a region stretching from the southern coast of the Levant northward towards Byblos, was once a prosperous collection of city-states. Its cities like Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gezer thrived as bustling hubs of trade. The Canaanites had built a rich and distinctive culture, trading extensively with Egypt, the Hittites, and the Mycenaeans, and serving as vital intermediaries along many of the Mediterranean's great maritime routes. But by the late 13th century BCE, archaeological evidence shows that a powerful wave of change swept through this region. Most notable among the groups of sea peoples who settled here were the Peleset, a group that modern scholars almost universally identify as the direct ancestors of the Philistines, a people famous in later history and in the biblical narrative. The reliefs at Medinet Habu depict the Peleset as one of the primary and most formidable forces within the Sea Peoples coalition that launched the Great Assault on Egypt. But unlike some of the other groups, the Peleset were not completely destroyed or driven off. A significant portion of them, after their defeat at the hands of Ramesses III, established permanent settlements along the fertile coastal lands of Canaan. Excavations at sites such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza have revealed a new and distinct layer of habitation appearing abruptly around 1200 BCE, a date that coincides perfectly with the known migrations of the Sea Peoples. What is so striking is that the material culture of this new layer, the pottery, the architecture, the tools, is markedly different from that of the native Canaanites. The pottery styles, in particular, reflect late Mycenaean or Aegean traditions. Architectural forms, burial customs, and even dietary patterns all point to the arrival of a new, seafaring population. From this group would emerge the people later known in the Hebrew Bible as the Philistines, who became key adversaries of the early Israelite tribes. The settlement of the Peleset in Canaan did more than just shift the regional balance of power. It fundamentally reshaped the demographic map of the Levant. The Canaanites did not disappear entirely, but in many key coastal areas, they were either replaced or gradually assimilated by these powerful new settlers. Archaeological evidence shows that the Philistines quickly built a strong economy, restored local trade networks, and developed a unique and vibrant cultural identity, blending their deep maritime origins with local Levantine influences. This reveals an important and often overlooked aspect of the Sea Peoples' migrations. They were not solely agents of destruction. They were also, in some cases, builders. Some groups chose to settle, adapt, and contribute to the cultural fabric of the lands they entered, leaving marks that would endure for millennia. And so, while the proud cities of the Mycenaeans crumbled, and while Hattusa and Ugarit became silent ruins, a new and dynamic chapter was unfolding in Canaan, a chapter that the Sea Peoples, through the Peleset, wrote with their very presence upon the land. But perhaps the most profound and far-reaching consequence of the Sea Peoples' wave of destruction was not the individual cities left in flames, but the complete and utter collapse of the vast network that had once connected the entire ancient world. The intricate international trade system of the late Bronze Age, a system that had taken centuries to build, was now shattered beyond any hope of repair. For nearly 2 centuries prior to the collapse, the civilizations across the Mediterranean had built what amounted to a fledgling global economy. It was a world in which vast maritime and overland trade routes linked Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, Ugarit, Canaan, Cyprus, Anatolia, and even regions beyond. Copper and tin, the very lifeblood of the Bronze Age, flowed continuously through this system. Along with these essential metals came cedarwood, gold, silver, ivory, precious stones, fine textiles, wine, olive oil, and countless other rare and valuable goods. Merchant ships laden with precious cargo once glided across the Mediterranean like shuttles in a giant loom, weaving a vast economic web that kept the complex, centralized palace economies of Egypt, the Hittites, and the Mycenaeans humming smoothly. But within the span of just a few decades, that entire network collapsed. The vital coastal trade routes were blockaded or completely severed by the marauding fleets of the Sea Peoples. Once thriving port cities like Ugarit were reduced to smoldering ruins. The ancient port of Byblos fell into a long decline. Alatia, modern Cyprus, the key supplier of copper for the entire region, was attacked and thrown into chaos. With the merchant fleets gone and the ports destroyed, the flow of copper and tin, essential for the production of weapons and tools, came to a grinding halt. This triggered a catastrophic domino effect across the civilized world. Without bronze, the palace economies collapsed, unable to maintain their military power or sustain their elite, non-productive ruling classes. The clay tablets from Ugarit and Pylos reveal that even as destruction loomed, city officials were still desperately trying to organize convoys, request aid, and mobilize their naval forces. But it was all in vain. The trade routes had become too unstable, too dangerous. From that point forward, the ancient world quickly descended from a state of complex order into one of fragmented chaos. International alliances unraveled. Diplomatic treaties that had once been carved in stone as eternal promises became meaningless, as the partners to those treaties either no longer existed or lacked the strength to fulfill their obligations. The highly centralized, palace-based economic system, which relied on a steady inflow of foreign goods, could not survive without trade. Palaces collapsed. The powerful aristocracies lost their basis of power. Skilled artisans found themselves unemployed. Entire populations were forced to revert to more primitive forms of subsistence living. Roads that were once bustling with commerce grew silent and overgrown. Warehouses that were once overflowing with goods stood empty and derelict. And the docks that had once echoed with the voices of merchants from a dozen lands were left with nothing but crumbling walls and lonely, weathered mooring posts. For this reason, many historians describe this collapse as one of the earliest and most dramatic examples of the failure of globalization. A world that was once deeply interconnected and seemingly stable proved to be astonishingly fragile in the face of sudden, systemic upheaval. And when the dust finally settled, the Mediterranean world, as it had been known for centuries, was no more. A new order, fragmented, localized, and uncertain, arose in its place, ushering in a dark age that would take centuries for humanity to fully recover from. As the Mediterranean world descended into this chaos, the urgent question of the true origins of the Sea Peoples became ever more critical for modern researchers trying to make sense of the catastrophe. One of the most prominent and enduring theories is this: that a significant segment of the Mycenaean Greek population, following the violent collapse of their own civilization, became a core component of the Sea Peoples wave, migrating and raiding across the Mediterranean. This theory arises from several compelling lines of evidence. First, as we have seen, between roughly 1211 and 50 BCE, the great Mycenaean palace cities were systematically destroyed. The centralized power structure collapsed, the aristocracy lost its economic base, and many communities were suddenly cut off from the imported food and luxury goods they had once relied upon. In this desperate environment, many Mycenaean groups would have been forced to leave their former centers in search of sheer survival. Archaeological evidence clearly shows that after the palace system fell, the population in the fertile plains of the Peloponnese declined sharply. Many once bustling coastal areas and Aegean islands were abandoned. At the very same time, in new regions, particularly along the Levantine coast, a new layer of habitation appeared, bearing clear Aegean cultural traits, especially in its pottery styles, architectural methods, and burial practices. Moreover, the name Denyen, which appears in the Egyptian lists of the Sea Peoples, may be connected to the term Danaoi or Danaoi, a name later used by the Greeks themselves in epic poems like the Iliad to describe the Mycenaean peoples. This has led many scholars to argue that some displaced Mycenaeans, rather than waiting to perish in their ruined cities, joined forces with other seaborne groups, forming armed migrant bands that fought their way across the sea, seeking new lands to settle. Yet, this theory also faces notable challenges. First, there is no direct evidence that the Sea Peoples who attacked Egypt spoke Greek or bore the distinct political symbols of the Mycenaean kingdoms. Second, the cultural diversity among the sea peoples was clearly immense, from the iconic horned helmets of the Shurdin to the round shields of the Pelé set, to weaponry and dress styles that varied greatly between the different groups. This strongly suggests that if the Mycenaeans were involved, they were but one part of a far more complex and multicultural alliance, not its sole or even dominant force. Furthermore, within Greece itself, archaeology shows that some Mycenaean communities did manage to persist after the crisis, especially in more remote rural areas and on certain islands. If the entire Mycenaean warrior class had transformed into sea peoples, such strong cultural continuity within Greece might not have been so apparent. Finally, many researchers caution that simply equating the sea peoples with the Mycenaeans risks oversimplifying what was clearly a very complex, multi-causal phenomenon. Archaeological evidence indicates that the sea peoples included a mixture of groups from Anatolia, the Balkans, the Aegean, and the Levant. In short, the idea that displaced Mycenaeans had contributed to the sea peoples wave is well supported by the evidence, but also contains significant gaps and uncertainties. And it is precisely these lingering mysteries that continue to fuel the endless fascination surrounding the sea peoples, a chapter of history that, the deeper we study it, reminds us that some answers may still lie just beyond our reach. In the ongoing effort to unravel the true nature of the sea peoples, a second major theory has drawn considerable attention from modern scholars. Could part of the sea peoples wave have been linked to migrating groups from the Balkans, particularly the Dorian tribes who were known to be moving southward during this same time of crisis? This theory is grounded in a series of intriguing observations from both archaeology and, more recently, modern genetic studies. According to many researchers, in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, waves of migration from the northern Balkans began moving south in earnest. Archaeological evidence shows that many settlements in the Danube Valley and across the Balkan Peninsula experienced major upheavals, likely driven by the same harsh climate shifts, population pressures, or internal conflicts that were affecting the wider region. Amid this turmoil, various tribal groups began to move down through Macedonia, Thessaly, and eventually into southern Greece. Among them was the group later known in Greek tradition as the Dorians. The arrival of the Dorians in southern Greece coincides very closely with the timing of the collapse of the Mycenaean cities. This has led some scholars to ask, could a portion of the Dorians or other migrating Balkan groups have joined forces with the seaborne coalition of the Sea Peoples, helping to drive a powerful armed migration across the Mediterranean? Archaeological clues offer some tantalizing hints. New layers of post-collapse settlement in the Peloponnese reveal sudden changes in architecture, burial practices, and pottery styles, reflecting a culture that was distinct from the earlier Mycenaean traditions. Similarly, along the Levantine coast, certain pottery types and construction techniques have been found that appear to bear traits associated with the Balkans or northern Greece. While this evidence is not strong enough to definitively prove that Dorians directly participated in the Sea Peoples campaigns, the timing is certainly suggestive. Perhaps most intriguing of all, the recent rise of ancient DNA research has added powerful new tools to this investigation. Scientists are now able to analyze the genetic makeup of ancient human remains from Greece, the Balkans, and the Levant. Preliminary results suggest that during the transition period after the Bronze Age collapse, there was a noticeable increase in genetic markers linked to Balkan populations within southern Greece and also in some coastal Levantine communities. This raises the distinct possibility that migrating Balkan groups not only entered southern Greece, but that some may have continued their journey, joining seaborne migrations and becoming part of the great Sea Peoples wave that so profoundly reshaped the entire region. Yet, as with all theories concerning the Sea Peoples, there are important counterpoints. First, the Dorians, according to later Greek tradition, are remembered for re-establishing power in southern Greece after the collapse, rather than for disappearing out to sea. If large numbers of Dorians had transformed into Sea Peoples, their strong and distinct cultural presence in later Greek history might not be so evident. Second, the Sea Peoples were clearly a highly diverse coalition. Assigning the Balkans a dominant role in their formation risks oversimplifying a phenomenon that demonstrably included groups from Anatolia, the Aegean, the Levant, and beyond. Finally, while genetic research holds great promise, the number of available ancient DNA samples remains too limited to draw firm conclusions about the scale and role of Balkan groups within the Sea Peoples. Even so, the theory of migrating groups from the Balkans, particularly the Dorians, playing a role adds an important dimension to our understanding. It reminds us that the Sea Peoples phenomenon was not a simple, linear event, but the result of multiple, overlapping migrations interacting in complex and unpredictable ways. And it is this very complexity that makes the story of the Sea Peoples so mysterious, so multifaceted, and so endlessly compelling, a puzzle we are still striving to piece together today. After carefully weighing the various theories, the idea of displaced Mycenaeans, the great migrations from the Balkans, many modern scholars have reached what is perhaps the most realistic and encompassing conclusion of all. The Sea Peoples were not a single, unified ethnicity, nor were they a fixed, long-standing alliance. They were most likely a temporary and fluid coalition, formed from many different desperate groups, each with its own origins and motivations, all swept up together in the swirling, multifaceted crisis of the era. This coalition theory is supported by a number of compelling observations. First, as we have seen from the detailed Egyptian records, particularly the Merneptah stele and the Medinet Habu reliefs, the Sea Peoples are always listed as a collection of highly diverse groups. The Shur-Den, the Shikalesh, the Pele-Set, the Jeker, the Denyen, the Lutka. None of these groups had a clearly recorded homeland in any surviving text. Their military traditions, their clothing, and their weaponry also varied widely in the Egyptian depictions. This has led many scholars to ask the logical question: if the Sea Peoples were a unified nation, why are their depictions and descriptions so distinct from one another? The most reasonable answer is that the Sea Peoples were likely a loose and shifting confederation, formed amid the broader regional collapse. In a world where harsh climate changes, widespread crop failures, and devastating earthquakes had shattered cities, and where international trade had completely broken down, the great empires grew weak and lost control of their peripheries. Countless groups, from displaced farmers and unemployed soldiers to opportunistic pirates and desperate migrant bands, may have come together to form mixed, mobile populations moving across the Mediterranean in search of survival. In this process, loose alliances between these groups likely arose out of pure, desperate necessity. Those groups with superior military strength or more advanced naval experience would naturally take on leadership roles, while others joined them in the hope of finding new lands, seizing wealth, or simply surviving the chaos. This would explain why, in the major campaigns such as the battles during the reign of Ramesses III, the Sea Peoples brought with them not only warriors but also their women, children, livestock, and wagons full of their belongings. They were not simply pirates on a raid. They were armed migrant groups, with permanent resettlement as one of their ultimate goals. Moreover, archaeological evidence from the Levant shows that the cultural footprints left behind by the Sea Peoples were highly inconsistent. Some sites reflect a strong Aegean influence, others an Anatolian one, and still others show a complex blend with local traditions. This further supports the idea that the Sea Peoples were not a homogeneous bloc, but rather the product of many different migrating peoples and forces converging amid the chaos of the time. And perhaps the most compelling aspect of this theory is that it reflects the true, volatile nature of the era. As the old world order collapsed and the centralized palace systems failed to protect their populations, people had little choice but to move. And in an age of such widespread turmoil, military strength became a critical means of survival. Thus, from a chaotic patchwork of disparate groups, a loose Sea Peoples coalition emerged, part fighting force, part refugee wave, all seeking a place to endure. Such a coalition could easily dissolve upon reaching new lands or evolve as circumstances changed, which helps to explain why their historical traces appear so fragmented and elusive. For this reason, many scholars today view the idea of a temporary, hybrid alliance as the most plausible and fitting explanation, and also as the primary reason why the mystery of the Sea Peoples continues to resist any final, simple answer. Of all the theories surrounding the rise of the Sea Peoples, perhaps the most compelling and fundamental is the one that centers on a profound climate crisis, because it offers insight not just into the Sea Peoples themselves, but into an entire world that was fracturing at its very foundations. Modern climate science, combining sophisticated analysis of polar ice cores, tree ring data, lake sediment records, and ancient pollen evidence, has shown that in the late 13th and throughout the 12th centuries BCE, the Mediterranean and Near East experienced a prolonged and exceptionally severe period of drought. These devastating drought cycles, which may have lasted for anywhere from 50 to 150 years, would have had a deep and catastrophic impact on the rain-dependent agricultural systems of many regions. In the Levant, sediment cores from the Sea of Galilee show sharp declines in rainfall, which in turn would have led to major drops in wheat and barley production. In Anatolia, tree ring studies from ancient pines reveal years of severely stunted growth, a clear scientific indicator of repeated, widespread crop failures. Meanwhile, in regions like the Aegean and the Balkans, with their rugged, mountainous terrain and limited pockets of fertile soil, food shortages would have become even more dire as the climate deteriorated. Against this desperate backdrop, the complex societies that had long depended on reliable trade networks and centralized palace economies began to lose their stability. As food became scarce, prices for grain would have soared, public unrest would have grown, and the lower strata of society would have been pushed toward the brink of desperation. With few options left, many groups would have been forced to abandon their ancestral homelands, joining great waves of mass migration. Yet, they were migrating through a world where much of the old political order had already collapsed and where the remaining fertile lands were now concentrated in a few scattered coastal cities or defensible river valleys. In such an environment, violent conflict was all but inevitable. Moreover, in such an unstable world, small, isolated migrant groups could not easily defend themselves. Thus, many would have chosen to band together, forming armed coalitions capable of both protecting their members and seizing the resources they needed to survive. And so, from a mix of desperate farming communities, unemployed soldiers, and displaced nomadic peoples, the alliances that came to be known as the Sea Peoples began to take shape. In this view, the Sea Peoples were not the original cause of the Bronze Age collapse, but were rather a direct and terrible consequence of a deepening climate and social crisis. Yet, as these powerful migrating groups moved across the region, their very presence dramatically accelerated the collapse that was already underway. Cities were destroyed, vital trade routes were severed for good, and farmers were driven from their fields, creating a spiraling, self-perpetuating cycle of violence and displacement. The archaeological evidence strongly supports this interpretation. The thick destruction layers found in cities such as Ugarit, Mycenae, and Pylos align closely with the known period of extended drought. And in the Levant, new populations with foreign material cultures appear in the archaeological record at precisely the moment when the old palace networks and international trade systems were breaking down. Many scholars today believe that this devastating combination of climate crisis and violent migration was likely the single most powerful driver behind the entire Sea Peoples phenomenon. A world that had relied for centuries on climate stability and the prosperity generated by trade, once stripped of those essential foundations, could not help but descend into waves of violence and migration. And in this terrible spiral, the Sea Peoples were neither pure villains nor mere victims, but the most visible and dramatic symbol of an entire era coming undone. But the deeper we dig into the story of the Sea Peoples, the more we run up against what may be the greatest wall of uncertainty in this entire mystery. We do not truly know where they came from. Across the thousands of clay tablets, the countless stone reliefs, and the written records of ancient civilizations, there is not a single line that clearly speaks of a homeland of the sea peoples. No nation is named. No king ever declares himself king of the Shurdin or king of the Pele-Set. No map from that era marks the territories of any of these groups. Why is that? Part of the reason lies in the very nature of the surviving historical sources, which come almost exclusively from the Egyptians, the ones who fought against and ultimately survived the sea peoples. Remember, Egypt was one of the few great civilizations to weather the storm of the sea peoples more or less intact. And the Egyptians had a very particular way of recording history. Every inscription, every stele, every temple relief was designed to glorify the pharaoh's victories and to reinforce the eternal, divine image of royal power. In that highly propagandistic style of recording, enemies were almost always portrayed as barbaric, stateless, and illegitimate, like waves of chaos crashing against the divine order maintained by the pharaoh. Even the way the sea peoples are listed in Egyptian texts reflects this approach. Group names are provided with only vague descriptors like from the sea or from foreign lands, with no clear geographical references or directional markers. This may well reflect the Egyptians' own genuine lack of knowledge about the specific origins of these diverse groups. But it may also have been an intentional propaganda strategy, aimed at obscuring the true identity of the enemy while magnifying the perceived power and omniscience of the pharaoh who defeated them. Moreover, the sea peoples themselves were not centralized empires with advanced administrative systems. They were, by all indications, loose coalitions of diverse groups, many of them migrants, climate refugees, or displaced communities. By their very nature, they left behind no native writing systems, no stone temples recording their history, and no royal chronicles of their own. What little survives of them comes to us only through the records of those who oppose them. And as every historian knows, history is most often written by the victors. Thus, virtually all that we know about the sea peoples today comes through the Egyptian lens, a biased lens crafted for political purposes and sometimes prone to exaggerate the pharaoh's achievements. Adding to this profound gap in our knowledge, many of the regions from which the sea peoples may have originated, the Anatolian coasts, the Aegean, various western Mediterranean islands, were themselves devastated during the Bronze Age collapse. Many cities were burned and never rebuilt. Older writing traditions, like Linear B in Greece, vanished completely. The potential sources of first-hand history from the homelands of the sea peoples simply did not survive the cataclysm. It is this powerful combination of the Egyptian bias in historical recording and the almost total absence of records from the sea peoples themselves that has left us with a nearly impenetrable gap in our understanding. And so, even though the sea peoples truly shook the entire Mediterranean world of their time, they remain, and may always remain, as shadows in the memory of humanity, a strange and powerful wave from the past whose echo we can still hear, but whose true shape we may never fully see. While the original homeland of the sea peoples remains an unsolved mystery, their journey after the collapse has left much clearer traces on the historical map. One of the most striking and best understood examples is the rise of the Philistines, a group that archaeological evidence now shows was directly linked to the Pele-Set, one of the key contingents of the sea peoples. As we saw in the dramatic reliefs at Medinet Habu, the Pele-Set played a major role in the great sea people's assault on Egypt. After their defeat at the hands of Ramesses III, a part of the Pele-Set force did not return to the sea or disappear. Instead, they settled permanently along the fertile coastal regions of Canaan. It was here, through a gradual process of adaptation and integration with local populations, that the distinct Philistine culture emerged, a culture that would go on to shape the political and cultural landscape of the Levant for centuries to come. Archaeological excavations in the cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, the famous Philistine Pentapolis, have provided clear and compelling evidence of this transformation. At Ashkelon, for instance, the archaeological layers reveal a new and distinct settlement horizon appearing abruptly around 1200 BCE, precisely the period when the sea peoples are known to have arrived in the region. In particular, Archaeologists have found large quantities of locally made, late Mycenaean-style pottery, a type of ceramic that was common in the Aegean but was extremely rare in Canaan before this period. This strongly suggests that new arrivals, who were bearers of this cultural tradition, had migrated from across the sea. At Gath, architectural styles and burial customs also point to the presence of a new community whose practices differed markedly from those of the native Canaanites. What is especially fascinating is how the early Philistines initially retained many elements of Aegean culture in their everyday objects, their architecture, and their rituals. Yet, over time, they skillfully blended into their new environment, creating a unique hybrid culture that combined their distant seafaring influences with strong local Levantine traditions. This evolution is particularly evident at sites like Ashkelon and Ekron, where later Philistine pottery developed its own distinctive style, no longer a mere imitation of Mycenaean forms, but a creative fusion. From a genetic standpoint, modern DNA analysis of burials from these sites has further revealed that early Philistine populations carry genetic markers consistent with Southern European or Western Mediterranean origins, reinforcing the theory that a segment of the Sea Peoples, specifically the Pele set, played a foundational role in the formation of this community. Thus, from what began as a wave of violent migration, the Sea Peoples, or at least some of their constituent groups, transitioned into stable and influential communities that left lasting marks on the historical record. The Philistines would go on to become a significant power in the Levant, frequently clashing with the emerging Israelite tribes as recorded extensively in the Hebrew Bible, and contributing to the complex political and cultural tapestry of the region. In this way, while most of the other Sea Peoples groups either dissolved or were assimilated without a trace, the story of the Philistines shows us that the Sea Peoples did not merely destroy. In some cases, they also created. And this, perhaps, stands as one of the clearest examples of how profound crises can forge entirely new orders out of the ruins of the old. After a portion of the Pele set, part of the Great Sea Peoples wave, settled along the coastal regions of Canaan and formed what would become the Philistine community. One key question has intrigued scholars for decades. Did Philistine material culture truly carry the distinct imprint of Mycenaean civilization? Modern archaeological excavations have provided a very compelling and affirmative answer. Yes, and it did so in ways that are both striking and subtle. The most prominent and most thoroughly studied evidence comes from their pottery. In the earliest Philistine occupation layers at sites like Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron, archaeologists have uncovered a large volume of pottery made in the style of late Mycenaean, where particularly a type known as Mycenaean IC. This type of pottery is distinguished by its intricate geometric patterns, its spirals, its wavy lines, and its designs of stylized birds, all painted in red or black on a light-colored background, a hallmark of Mycenaean artistry at the very twilight of the Bronze Age. Crucially, scientific analysis of the clay has proven that these pottery pieces found in Canaan were not imported from Greece. They were made locally, indicating that the artisans who carried this rich ceramic tradition had physically migrated to this new land and were producing their wares on site. This points to a genuine movement of people, not merely the spread of trade goods or artistic influence. Architecture also offers intriguing clues. At Ekron, archaeologists have discovered buildings that feature open hearth porch designs, an architectural element that has clear parallels in late Mycenaean domestic structures. The kilns and craft workshops that have been unearthed, their employed techniques closely resembling those used in the great craft centers of the Aegean. Funerary practices provide further evidence. In early Philistine cemeteries, archaeologists have found simple pit burials, which were sometimes accompanied by grave goods that reflected Aegean traditions, a practice that stands in stark contrast to the typical Canaanite customs of the time, which favored collective tombs or rock-cut chambers. Altogether, this body of evidence paints a vivid and coherent picture. In their earliest phase of settlement, Philistine culture bore a strong and unmistakable Mycenaean imprint, visible in their pottery, their architecture, and their ritual life. But here is where the story becomes even more fascinating. Within just 2 or 3 generations, Philistin material culture began to evolve significantly. The Mycenaean IC-style pottery gradually gave way to uniquely Philistin styles, featuring new shapes and decorative motifs that reflected a creative blending of Aegean, Egyptian, and local Canaanite influences. Architectural forms also began to incorporate more Levantine features, and burial practices shifted further toward the regional norms. This rapid evolution suggests that the Philistines were not passive bearers of a static Mycenaean culture. They were an active and dynamic people who adapted, blended, and reshaped their cultural identity in response to their new environment, forging a distinctive hybrid tradition that honored their distant roots while embracing the realities of life in Canaan. Today, archaeologists often classify this early Philistin culture from circa 1200 to 1150 BCE as Philistin I, the phase where the Mycenaean imprint is most visible. Later phases, Philistin II and Philistin III, mark the emergence of a more distinctly Philistin identity, more localized and richly adapted to their Levantine setting. In this way, the legacy of the Sea Peoples was not limited to layers of ash and ruins. It also flowed into new and vibrant cultural currents, leaving lasting imprints that enriched the complex historical tapestry of the Mediterranean. And the Mycenaean legacy within Philistin culture stands as one of the clearest and most fascinating testaments to that complex journey. While the traces of the Peleset, the group of sea peoples who would become the Philistines, have been brought to light through careful and painstaking archaeological study, the ultimate fate of the other named groups of the Sea Peoples remains far more obscure. And this is not surprising. As we have seen, the Sea Peoples were not a single, unified ethnic group. They were a loose and fluid alliance of disparate tribes and peoples, each with its own origins, its own identity, and its own motivations. As the great crisis of the Late Bronze Age came to an end, many of these groups, if they were not destroyed in battle, would have gradually blended into the various Mediterranean societies where they eventually settled. Within just a few generations, their distinct cultural identities would have largely dissolved. The names that once rang out with terror from Egyptian inscriptions, Shurdin, Shikalesh, Jeker, Dinyan, Lukka, simply vanish from the historical record. But this does not mean that these peoples vanish from the face of the earth. It is far more likely that the survivors of these groups were slowly absorbed into local cultures, whether in the lands they had attacked or in the more remote regions where they ultimately settled. Consider a few plausible examples. The Shurdin may have established themselves somewhere in the western Mediterranean. Some scholars suggest they contributed to the unique warrior culture of ancient Sardinia, where the great, enigmatic stone towers, known as nuraghi, still stand today, silent witnesses to an ancient era of upheaval. The Shikalesh, whose name so strongly evokes Sicily, may have similarly merged into the island's native communities, their distinct identity gradually fading into the evolving Sicilian culture. The Jeker left perhaps the faintest trace of all. At the site of Dor on the modern coast of Israel, archaeologists have uncovered a layer of occupation featuring cultural elements that are not entirely Canaanite. This may reflect the presence of a small settlement of Jeker, though in time, the dominant local culture once again reasserted itself. The Dinyan, possibly linked to the Danawi, a term for Mycenaean Greeks, likely reintegrated into the broader Greek-speaking world during the complex migrations and resettlements of Greece's so-called Dark Age. The Lukka, long associated with the Lycian region of Anatolia, may have blended back into the Anatolian highland communities, persisting under new names and new social structures, no longer connected to the Sea People's identity that had been recorded by the Egyptians. Across all of these cases, the pattern is likely the same. Once the great storm of history had passed and Mediterranean civilizations began to slowly stabilize and regroup, the scattered remnants of the Sea Peoples groups could not maintain their distinct identities for long. Without a formal administrative structure, Without their own written traditions, and without strong cultural institutions to preserve their identity across generations, assimilation was all but inevitable. And when that happened, the names like Shur-din, Shikalesh, and Jeker faded into memory, leaving only faint, ghostly echoes on Egyptian stele and lingering as tantalizing puzzles for future historians. Today, when we trace the legacy of the Sea Peoples, we are not just reading layers of ash and ruin. We are also deciphering the story of blended bloodlines and transformed cultural identities that quietly reshaped Mediterranean civilizations from within. And perhaps this is why, even after more than 3,000 years, the mystery of the Sea Peoples continues to captivate historians and archaeologists alike. For they represent a great wave of history that cannot be easily pinned down, a force of human movement and transformation whose consequences and legacies remain subtly and invisibly woven into the very fabric of Mediterranean history. And so, after tracing every faint footprint, every layer of ash, and every surviving written fragment, we can begin to truly understand why the Sea Peoples have become one of the greatest and most enduring mysteries of the ancient world. It is not because they never existed. On the contrary, their immense impact is clearly visible in the archaeological layers, in the smoldering ruins of fallen cities, and the ghostly outlines of vanished civilizations. It is not because there are no records of them, for the inscriptions of Egypt and the layers of new material culture in Canaan, the Levant, and the Aegean all tell fragmented pieces of their story. But perhaps this is precisely what makes the mystery so utterly compelling. The more evidence we manage to uncover, the more we realize that what we know is only the visible tip of a vast, submerged iceberg of history. First and foremost, the ultimate origins of the Sea Peoples remain profoundly elusive. For more than a century, scholars have tried to trace the roots of each individual group. Peleset to the Philistines, Shur-din to Sardinia, Shikalesh to Sicily, Dinyan to the Mycenaean Danawi, Jeker and Lukka to parts of Anatolia. And yet, no single theory has proven strong enough to achieve universal consensus. Even in the Egyptian records, the Sea Peoples are always described as amorphous waves of invaders from the sea or from foreign lands, with no nation, no known kings, and no recorded capital cities. This made them one of the most shadowy and ungraspable foes that the ancient civilizations ever faced. Second, the Sea Peoples left behind no written history of their own. There is no Sea Peoples Chronicle, no victory stele proudly recounting their triumphs from their own perspective, no surviving texts telling their story in their own voice. Everything we know about them comes from the other side, from the records of the Egyptians, from the scattered archaeological traces they left behind, and from the silent ruins of the civilizations they struck and then vanished from. This ensures that their image will remain forever half seen and half unknown. We cannot say with any certainty how strong they were, how numerous, how well organized, or even whether they were a single, coordinated force or multiple, successive waves of migration layered upon one another. Third, while the impact of the Sea Peoples is undeniable, their own material legacy is incredibly difficult to trace. They helped to bring about, or at least dramatically accelerate, the collapse of many of the great Bronze Age civilizations. The Hittite Empire fell, the Mycenaean world was devastated, Ugarit was burned to the ground, and many Canaanite cities were conquered or transformed. Yet, after the Great Wave had passed, most of the Sea Peoples groups either merged into local societies or simply faded from memory. They left behind layers of ash and distinctive early ceramic styles showing Aegean influence, but no lasting new civilization that bore the name of the Sea Peoples. Their story is like that of a great tsunami crashing across the landscape of history, leaving deep and permanent scars in its wake. But the wave itself dissolves and disappears before anyone could fully record its nature. And perhaps it is this very elusiveness that makes the Sea Peoples so endlessly fascinating. We have no shortage of tales about mighty empires with their grand palaces and their detailed written chronicles. But the story of the Sea Peoples is the story of the outsiders to those official histories, desperate, determined communities whose own voices were never preserved, but who nonetheless reshaped the course of an entire era. And in that very shadowy nature, the Sea Peoples will likely continue to challenge the imagination and the patience of scholars, and of all of us, for many centuries to come. But perhaps in this entire journey to understand the Sea Peoples, the most profound question is not who they were, but how history has, or has not, remembered them. For without the stone inscriptions of Egypt, we might never have even known that a great wave of Sea Peoples once shook the ancient world. Nearly everything we know about them comes from the Egyptian records, from the Merneptah stele, and from the epic carvings in the temple of Medinet Habu under Ramesses III. It is from these inscriptions that the names Pele-Set, Shur-Din, Shikalesh, Jeker, Dinyin, and Lutko were preserved for posterity. It is from these reliefs that we see the vivid images of warriors with their iconic horned helmets and round shields, and of migrating families, women, children, and livestock in tow, moving as part of this great and terrible upheaval. Without these precious records, all the archaeological evidence, the layers of ash at Ugarit, Mycenae, and Pylos, the new settlement layers in Canaan, would have remained a collection of isolated, disconnected clues, difficult to connect into a coherent picture of such a vast and coordinated wave of armed migration. And yet, this very fact also reminds us of an essential and sobering truth. History is so often written by the victors. It was Egypt, one of the few great civilizations to survive the storm of the Sea Peoples, that got to record this story, and it did so through its own highly biased lens. In the inscriptions, the pharaoh is always the triumphant, godlike hero. The Sea Peoples are always the barbaric, faceless invaders who are decisively defeated. There is no voice from the Sea Peoples themselves. There is no record of their story as seen through the eyes of those who may have been forced to abandon their homelands, who crossed the sea in desperation, and who fought to survive in a hostile world. This is what makes the story of the Sea Peoples both fascinating and deeply sobering. For what remains in the historical record is always but one side of a much larger and often more complex tale. If, one day, a chronicle written by the Sea Peoples themselves were to be discovered, assuming one was ever written, the story we think we know today might look very different. But perhaps that chronicle will never be found. The Sea Peoples, by their very nature, were likely migrating communities without a strong, centralized administrative structure and without an enduring system of record-keeping. And in that sense, they are among the great lost voices of history. This, too, is a larger lesson. How many events, how many peoples, how many stories once shook the ancient world, but because no one recorded them from their side, we will never even know they existed. The Sea Peoples, by a stroke of fortune or misfortune, left just enough traces in Egyptian stone for us to follow their story today. But surely, many other Sea Peoples in the long and tumultuous human story have been swallowed by complete silence, leaving behind nothing but layers of anonymous earth and stone. And perhaps this is what makes the mystery of the Sea Peoples so endlessly compelling. For it is not just their story, but a story about how history itself is recorded, how human memory is preserved, and how many voices have been forgotten along the way. As our journey through the story of the Sea Peoples reaches its final lines, perhaps an even larger and more unsettling question lingers in the mind. If not for the chance survival of a few inscriptions in Egypt, we might never have known that the Sea Peoples had existed at all. So how many other chapters of human history, how many entire communities, how many civilizations, how many epic stories have been completely and utterly erased from humanity's collective memory? The layers of earth that we painstakingly uncover today reveal only the smallest, most durable fragments of the past. The written records that have managed to survive the ravages of time are the voices of only the few civilizations that manage to preserve their own history. Behind every carved stone, every broken shard of pottery, and every line etched into a temple wall lies a vast, silent ocean of things unknown and perhaps unknowable. This is why the journey of exploring history never truly ends. For history is not only about what we know, it is also, and perhaps more importantly, about what has been forgotten, what has been buried, or what was never recorded at all. The Sea Peoples offer one of the most vivid and haunting examples of this. They were an anonymous wave that reshaped the political, economic, and cultural map of the entire Mediterranean world, and yet their own identity has all but faded into the sands of time. But they're not the only ones. If the Sea Peoples could shake an entire age to its foundations, and yet today we still do not know with certainty who they truly were, how many other stories have been completely lost, leaving not a single trace in the written records we now possess. Perhaps somewhere in a distant land, beneath layers of earth yet to be unearthed, new clues still lie hidden, fragments that could forever change the way we understand our shared past. And perhaps through our continued curiosity, through every story we tell and every question we ask, we can help to keep these great mysteries alive, so that history remains not a closed book of settled facts, but an ever-opening door to new discoveries. There is still so much we do not know about our past, and the journey to explore these forgotten histories and unsolved mysteries must continue. For this journey, like history itself, will never truly come to an end.